Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar. We'll probably give it a couple of minutes for anyone who might be joining to join. I believe you should be able to turn your cameras on if you want to participate in this way. However, your mics will remain on mute. There you go. Okay, well, I'm sure that people will be able to join if they want to as we go forward. But welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar, where we'll be discussing how we can use the technology, specifically the no fence and sort of mob grazing technology in reinstating the natural processes. So please meet Sam and Finley, who will be leading you through today's discussion. And just a note for you, we'll hear a couple of presentations from both Sam and Finley, and then there will be a discussion between them on the subject matter. And towards the end, we're going to have a brief Q&A section. So in the top bar, you will see a Q&A button next to chat. So please feel free throughout the duration of the webinar to pop your questions over there, and we will tend to them later on. But other than that, welcome and thank you for joining us, and I'll pass over to Sam.
Okay, right. Hello. I am just going to share my presentation on screen, so that should be appearing shortly. Welcome. The subject that we're going to be discussing today is on application of no fence technology in nature restoration projects. We're not going to be talking about farming systems, strictly speaking. So this is more about how we use cattle in particular, using no fence as a habitat management tool and a engine and driver of ecological change. I'm Sam Durham. I am Director of Ecological Operations at Restore. So Restore is a specialist nature restoration company, and we manage a fairly large portfolio of land across the UK. I can't remember the latest hectareage, but it's in the tens of thousands of hectares in total. So it's pretty large, it's pretty varied. There are some small sites and there's some really large sites. And my role here at Restore is basically to sort of oversee our entire program of ecological implementation. And no fence is becoming a key tool in that. Finn, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Sam. Hello, I am Finley. I work for No Fence. So I'm here today to really try and answer any questions about our virtual fencing system, and speaking about the applications of the system in a rewilding and nature restoration way.
Cool. Thank you very much, Finn. So there's a few words that I've kind of plonked on screen here in the top right that I think are worth kind of holding in mind as we sort of work through the presentation, as we talk about how this technology helps us in the process of nature restoration. And I think just sort of try and absorb those for a second, and I think you'll see why they're key themes. But adaptive, nature-led in terms of how we apply this technology, and why movement is critical, and how this technology helps us move stock as agents of ecological change. So I'm going to sort of move on to the next slide, which is probably a bit text heavy and has probably got some very familiar statistics on there. But I think the broad theme we really want to communicate here is that large herbivores play a really crucial role in maintaining biodiversity, in driving biodiversity and maintaining it across landscapes, and that can be at the individual farm scale or across sort of entire catchments, entire hill chains. And these herbivores would have had sort of native proxies thousands of years ago. So wild cattle, wild horses, things like this that would have been driving habitat change, driving habitat dynamism. We got busy hunting those out, removed them from the landscape, and lost a lot of that dynamism, a lot of that function. And for thousands of years, traditional agriculture in some ways replicated some of those functions, sort of extensive moving of livestock through landscapes, creating kind of open areas, disturbed areas, and that low intensity and constant or regular movement sort of replicated quite a lot of ecological function that was initially hunted out. In the last 100 years in particular, we've really lost that. So we now have a very simplified habitatscape across the UK, and that's resulted in some really quite dramatic declines in biodiversity. And that matters for a whole range of reasons. Intrinsically, that is obviously something we don't want to see, and it has lots of ripple effects on the resilience of land, the resilience of habitats, and the functions that those habitats are able to provide for us in terms of flood mitigation, carbon sequestration, soil health. So what we know is that static kind of concentrated set stocking of livestock really is not conducive to that diverse landscape that maximizes biodiversity. We know that this results in very simple, short, closely grazed systems. We also know a few other things about those systems, that they're not very adaptable. You can move stock between paddocks, obviously, but it's quite hard to react to ecological conditions on the ground. And also really monitoring and understanding how livestock are moving across large areas is currently a bit of a knowledge gap. There's all these sorts of problems with both the habitat structure and how we use livestock in restoration that sort of require a fairly novel approach. We are unlikely to have really extensive unenclosed landscapes in large areas that we can drive stock across, and shepherding systems and things like this. So we need a technology that can kind of help us move livestock around the landscape. In a kind of visual nutshell, what we want to achieve through lots of our projects is a transition from uniform overgrazed static systems that support very little biodiversity into complex mosaic ecosystems, things that are three-dimensional shifting patterns of scrub and grassland and water and disturbance over time. And how do we both use cattle in particular as a driver of that change and as a part of the ecosystem? So how do we move from what we have on the left side of the screen to what we have on the right side of the screen? And surprise, surprise, this guy knows what the solution is. So no fence technology is really quite an incredible tool for us to be able to kind of solve a range of these problems with landscape management. So I'm gonna there's another wall of text here, so I won't dwell on this a lot, and we can share the slides afterwards. But essentially what no fence does for us is it allows us to dynamically move livestock around a landscape. So it allows us to monitor what's happening on the ground ecologically and make decisions about how do we move those animals around. How do we start to replicate the roles of lost predators as far as we can? How do we sort of recreate some of that landscape of fear and push cattle around the landscape to avoid overgrazing, to avoid undergrazing, to keep some dynamism in the overall system. And Finlay will talk in detail about this, but some of, as well as being able to control the movements of cattle, the data that the collars generate is really useful to us. It allows us to kind of overlay that information with the results of ecological monitoring and start to look for correlations, start to look for sort of trends in biodiversity that might be influenced by concentrations of where cattle are, where they sort of rest up overnight, where they seasonally move to and concentrate, this sort of thing. In recovering habitats and recovering ecosystems, we'll often have particularly sensitive areas. So whilst rewilding, whilst extensive nature restoration aims to get to a less hands-on place further down the line, initially in those phases of recovery, we want to be able to give, you know, sensitive habitats, rare plant communities, things like this, the chance to recover. And sometimes that means restricting sort of cattle access or livestock access to those areas. So being able to use a technology that allows us to sort of monitor change over time, see where potentially sensitive features come up, and control cattle's access to that is really useful. Most wildlife in the UK is actually surprisingly unfazed by traditional fencing. There are some species that find that problematic, and some of those are of greater or lesser conservation concern, but one that's kind of underappreciated, I think, is wading birds. So very often species such as lapwing and curlew need to be able to directly lead their chicks between nesting sites and wetland margin foraging areas. Stock netting with vegetation growing up through it can provide a sort of real barrier to that, a genuine barrier. So so wherever we can avoid the need for fencing, we want to do that. And I suppose a caveat to all of this is to say, when we look at cattle as agents of habitat change, the technology is really useful, but also the breed selection is really important for us. There are some breeds that are genuinely much more adventurous, I would say, and happy to tackle scrub. So when we pick out species such as Highlands, Belter Galloways, Longhorns, that are more inclined to tackle scrub habitats and sort of create those dynamic patterns of scrub and grass, that paired with the ability to push them to do that where we need to is really very useful. So this, I suppose, just reinforces those points. So really, on some of, particularly on really large scale sites, and to an extent this applies to smaller sites as well, fencing, as we've just touched on, is often undesirable hard fencing and quite costly and impractical. It isn't really scalable if we want large scale nature restoration across large chunks of the UK. In terms of that kind of monitoring element, there are all sorts of emerging natural capital monitoring frameworks and biodiversity frameworks where it's sort of early reporting requirements are starting to ask for data and information on how the land has been managed, and that's often quite hard to get quantitative scalable data sets. And again, the sort of no fence data provides us with something really useful where we can demonstrate compliance with a management plan that involved livestock elements, and sort of reporting on overall management activity. And that's probably it from me, I think. So Finlay, I will hand over to you. So if you could just sort of intro No Fence for us, and then yeah, I'll stop sharing and you can share your slides.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. So I'm not sure how much people in this call know about No Fence, but essentially No Fence is a company we were founded in 2011 by a Norwegian goat farmer. And since then, we're now available in 6 countries and we've sold over 200,000 units. We sell a cattle collar and then we sell a sheep and goat collar. And these collars work independently of any physical infrastructure needed on the ground. They use mobile network and they also use GPS. But I'll head into more of that shortly. But essentially, as Sam's kind of touched on, the no fence system gives the ability to move cattle whenever you want from wherever you are in the world, and it gives you the data to back that up. So through a heat map on the app, you're able to see the areas the animals have or haven't been grazing. You'd also be able to access a herd replay, so we can go back to a set date and time, and we can look exactly where the collars have been grazing. The system works with an app on your phone. You draw a boundary, and when the animals cross that boundary, they start to receive an audio cue. That audio cue goes on for around 10 seconds. And if the animals don't turn around after that 10 seconds is up, they will then receive a mild electric pulse. If I share my screen now, I will talk a little bit more about the no fence system. So I hope you can all see my screen now. And I'm now just showing you basically the no fence hardware that we sell. So on the left hand side, you've got the cattle collar with a charger and a battery. And then on the right hand side, we've got a sheep and goat collar with a charger and a battery. There is also a shelter beacon with the sheep and goat collar, which is quite common if you were to run, say, your goats with a field shelter. The shelter beacon essentially stops GPS drift from taking place when that animal is in a shelter. So how it works, as I touched on before, the no fence system uses GPS and mobile connectivity. GPS covers essentially the animal's interaction, so where that animal is and where their virtual boundary is. And the mobile network is used for all of the communication from app to collar and collar to app. This means that you do need a kind of a mobile phone signal in the areas you're going to be using the collars. But if there is, say, a corner of the field with no mobile connectivity, the boundary is still active when the animal is in that area. The person controlling the app, however, will not be able to do anything on the app. So setting a boundary, receiving a notification, or seeing locations won't be able to happen when the collars are in an area of no mobile signal. This, however, if the collar is in an area of no mobile signal and then comes back into an area of mobile signal, you will still be able to receive all of the GPS data from when that collar was in an area of no mobile phone signal. The no fence system also has an added benefit we released in, I believe it was October last year, something we coined HerdNet technology. HerdNet essentially means that all of the collars in a pasture will connect to each other via Bluetooth. And it does mean that if you were doing a pasture update, so we're wanting to mob graze them when we're wanting to move them onto a new bit of land, as long as one collar is able to connect to the server and get that information of the new pasture, it can then Bluetooth it to the rest of the herd. And this has really good implications for areas of poor mobile phone signal. If you've got 10 or 20 collars in a field, you essentially have 10 or 20 times the chance of one of those collars connecting to the mobile network. And in the UK, in terms of the mobile network, we use EE, Vodafone 3 and O2, and that's either 2G or 4G. So this is how the no fence boundary works. As I touched on before, you draw the boundary in your app, and as an animal crosses that boundary, they will start to receive an audio cue that goes on for a minimum of 10 seconds. If that animal doesn't turn around after that 10 seconds is up, they will then receive a mild electric pulse. If the animal then carries on going for whatever reason, that process will repeat 2 more times. So for a total of 3 audio cues and 3 electric pulses. After the 3rd electric pulse is received to the animal, you will then get a notification to your phone letting you know this animal has escaped. And if, say, you've got 20 animals in a pasture and 1 or 2 of them are spooked and bolted out of the pasture, those 2 can always return to be back into the pasture without any audio cues or electric pulses on the way back in. And you'll then get a new notification to your phone saying this animal has returned to pasture and the boundary will once again be reactivated. So I'm going to talk slightly about a rewilding case study in Stutland Bay. So this is 230 acres of dunes and heathlands, a sensitive SSSI site, and has high visitor pressure with millions of visits annually. This was part of a 2020 trial, so it's a few years old now, but this was aiming to test the no-fence system for rewilding without any physical boundaries. So the conservation challenge was over stabilization of the dunes. Too much shrub and gorse and dense grasses growing was also leading to species being lost due to no bare sand being available. And there was also public access issues with a lot of members of the public passing through this site. So physical fencing being expensive, but also restricting movement of these members of the public. And why virtual fencing? Because it allowed them to keep the open aesthetic of the heaths. It gave management the agility to be able to move boundaries whenever they want to, having the app on their phone so they can see the data of where the animals have been concentrating their grazing and shifting those boundaries accordingly. And it also allowed unrestricted access of the site for humans, but also non-target wildlife that could have been restricted by physical boundaries being in place. So in this study, 10 Devon steers were selected. This was mainly for their docile temperaments due to the fact there were a lot of public access through the site. And the animals were first trained in a fenced pasture for a week to allow them to get used to the system. After this week, the animals were then released onto the dunes and put to work, essentially. Through this trial, they had a 99% containment effectiveness. This meant that during the peak trial period, there were essentially no escapes from the cattle. And the heat map data confirmed that the grazing intensity was concentrated exactly where the habitat management was most needed. That is the key thing about our no fence technology. It can back up with data where the animals have been and where they haven't been, and it would allow someone to make an informed decision on where to alter the boundaries or where we want the cattle grazing. So the positive outcomes of this trial were that the cattle successfully trampled the scrub and they exposed bare sand, creating areas for sand lizards and flora. The data-led management allowed the managers to track movement 24/7, and this enabled scientific assessment of these areas and really telling what work are these cattle doing and backing it up with evidence and boots on the ground being able to look at those areas. There are also huge cost-saving implications. The fact they could just collar a set amount of animals and graze those in those areas however they want was a huge saving compared to fencing the whole area and then potentially needing someone to say move electric fences, monitor the cattle, that type of thing. The no fence system also gives the manager's ability. So even if someone's not on the site, you can still receive a notification if an animal's not moving, if it's moving less, and obviously if an animal's escaped. So a lot of public access, a big open site, but you still have peace of mind. You know where the cattle are and you know they're moving enough. So the challenges cited in this experiment were a couple. This is slightly outdated, so a few of these points we have addressed in the last couple of years, which is worth noting, but I'll go into that. So GPS drift was a bit of an issue. Sometimes the boundaries moved slightly. With our newer collar that we sell these days, GPS accuracy has been very much addressed, but it is still definitely something that should be taken into consideration when someone's considering adopting no fence technology. Our average GPS accuracy is around 2 meters. But if you are grazing in a woodland, if you're grazing next to a building or steep sides, this can affect the GPS accuracy. Power management was also a challenge in this experiment. Since then, we've had huge updates to both the software and the hardware in regard to our system, which has significantly improved the battery life of our product. With the cattle collar, the battery life will last about 8 to 10 months during the kind of grazing summer season. And then during the winter, it's probably around 5 to 6 months. There's a difference between the summer and the winter months due to the fact that every collar has a solar panel on it. Network reliance was also an issue. We have now signed up more network providers to our system, and also the HerdNet technology really helps this connectivity issue very much so. As I'm sure you can guess, our system's quite often used in large expanses of land, rural areas with poor mobile phone signal. This is really something we've addressed, and it's something that's got an awful lot better in the last year. And the last one was individual learnings. So some cattle potentially being slower to pick up the systems than others, and careful selection for temperament. The temperament issue was mainly just due to the public access on the site, but individual learnings is something that does happen. The benefit of running it with cattle is a strong herd mentality. So even if one cow ever does escape, there is a strong herd instinct pull to bring that cow back into the rest of the group and back into the virtual boundary. And the cattle often will also learn from each other about the system. And that is it for me. Thank you, guys.
So just before I let you press on with the rest of discussion, just a reminder to everyone to use the Q&A panel if you do have any questions about anything at all that you have heard so far. So in the top bar next to the chat button, you can pop your questions and we will address them towards the end.
Nice, thank you, Aggie. So, Finn, did you want to kick off with some questions, and then we can go from there?
Yep, I can do indeed. So for kind of the project you're envisioning, what type of data would be, most interested for you, would you say? And would you be using the no fence data to then back it up with boots on the ground approach of then checking out the area and seeing what impact the cattle have actually made?
Yeah, so I think there's the data point. The data is really useful and interesting, but I think like pretty much every other type of data we gather and analyze, we have to sort of start with like, what are we actually trying to achieve here, and is this going to tell us anything useful? So across large-scale nature restoration projects, there is an element of, when we have on-ground project managers or work with farmers, there's a degree of on-ground sort of observational recording. But the big data sets that are generated through the collars, that are generated through other methods like bioacoustic monitoring, things like that, they really only become truly useful for us in the long term, because we're taking this kind of you start by looking at the problems with the ecosystem. You essentially in a very informed way theorize about what needs to happen to improve ecological conditions, and then you kind of have to set that sort of cattle movement kind of regime in place, and then see what happens over a long period of time. So and we're really talking, it can be useful when we have a project manager going out and seeing that there's really excessive poaching around an area where we were trying to recover marginal vegetation along a river and things like that, and we can just look. I mean, it's a little useful to be able to say, look, yeah, we had a really high concentration here, and they're only going to this one watering spot, and it helps just think about why. But really, in the long term, we're looking at sort of taking our baseline data for most, for bioacoustics, for soil biological health, for all these things, and our monitoring intervals are kind of like every 3 years very often. So we're looking at really long-term change, and that's where that kind of zoomed out picture of cattle movement over time becomes quite informative in seeing how that might relate to where we get to in terms of habitat structure and overall biodiversity. So.
And would there be any difference between, would you be looking into individual cattle? Maybe that's just differences between actually individuals or different breeds. You did mention kind of the breeds you mentioned were kind of native breeds. Is that something you're really looking into because they're better at trampling and they're less selective in what they're eating?
Yeah, I think so. So at the moment we're not looking. We've kind of got a starting point where we know enough about the cattle breeds that we want to use and why we want to use those ecologically, because they are more adventurous. They are generally happier or more willing to be pushed through scrub and things like this. They are often horned breeds that are, and that's really useful for debarking trees, for bashing and tearing up scrub, for kind of tearing chunks of ground, particularly when the bulls are sort of in heat. That's probably the wrong term, but so we kind of start with some knowledge and assumptions about what breeds we want to use. And then I suppose the data allows us to actually sort of understand whether those assumptions have proven true. Like in some situations we've had livestock breeds where theoretically it should work perfectly, and if we've had this with old breed cattle, and not so relevant to this discussion, but also with conic horses, where we assume they're going to do a certain job, and they just, because of the way they were reared, other sort of factors, they grew up sort of on pasture for too long or whatever, they're just really not keen on scrub. So I suppose it just helps us understand whether our assumptions were right and whether the breeds are kind of doing the job we expected them to, I suppose.
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense.
We've got one question which I would like to throw in. So, Sam, you mentioned projects moving and looking at simplified versus complex landscape. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose sort of going back to ecological basics, really, there's a few things that we know really turbocharge biodiversity in a landscape, and one is structural complexity. And what I mean by that is you have a very three-dimensional habitat. When you look across it, it's very uneven, obstructed, complicated sightlines. We've got scrub, we've got grass, we've got scattered trees, we've got broken sort of open canopy woodland, and what that generates is loads and loads of sunlit edge habitat that is quite rich in pollen and nectar and berries and this sort of thing. So it's not appropriate for all landscapes, but that structure is really key for most of our biodiversity. A very high proportion of our species have evolved to really thrive in those edge habitats, from birds to invertebrates to small mammals, reptiles, even amphibians. So, and we also know that if we want that structural complexity, but if you completely abandon land, you end up with, again, quite a simple structure, and so you want change and turnover of those habitats. You want cattle to be pushing scrub down. Other species we use, not with no offence, would be pigs opening up the ground and sort of allowing scrub banks to sort of pop up. So I suppose the two things we're often looking to re-inject are structural complexity and dynamism, change across time. We're not trying to fix this area is scrub, this area is woodland, this area is grass, and that's and cattle are other livestock as well, but old breed cattle are really helpful for achieving both of those. I hope that's sort of answered the question.
Thank you. I've got a couple more, so I'll just proceed to those. Have you had any farmers, landowners using no-fence technology to re-establish transhuman systems? The collars seem a far simpler way to replicate large herbivore movements in farmed landscapes than miles and miles of fencing.
Yeah, so the answer is we have landowners that wanted to do it, and also that use that exact term. So want to sort of live a transhumanist lifestyle, want to kind of herd cattle across large areas. And we work with a farm in Wiltshire that is at least in part switching from a sheep stock system to an old breed cattle stock system, and that project will involve a lot of fence removal and a lot of that transhumance, that spending much more time in the field with the cattle, observing how they're behaving, moving them across the landscape, and absolutely the advantage that we have as a 21st century sort of nomadic herder, other than being able to go and get a hot shower after sort of a day in the field, is actually being able to much sort of more effectively control and drive where those animals go. So yeah, that's a really nice point. I think there's a kind of in big open landscapes, there's this kind of really ancient form of moving stock, this transhumance, this shepherding, this kind of herding, and this definitely gives a really powerful tool to make that sort of much more doable across large areas. Yeah.
How about you, Finley? Have you come across any examples in your work with No Fence of those kinds of?
I mean, people wanting to move their cattle regularly is a major selling point of No Fence, and I've got a large amount of customers that will do that. I'm not sure, particularly in kind of a nature restoration rewilding example, but one example from me, I went up and visited a farm in Cumbria, and he's running about 250 acres of hill land, and he's actually moving his cattle every single day. And essentially the cows are then not touching the same piece of grass for just under a year at a time. And there's a lot of benefits to that for the grass and the soil, as we all well know, but also for the cattle themselves and the farmer. Reduce worming costs, better grass, you're able to get more out of it, that type of thing. And it's something that's really easily done with our No Fence system. It's going to take you a matter of 2 to 3 minutes from getting on your phone to those cattle then realizing there's not a noise here and then moving into that new patch of grass.
Thank you. Another question here. Does using certain breeds for ecosystem engineering affect their cultural importance in particular region?
Yeah, so and that's almost like anything that's involved in large scale nature restoration, rewilding, if we dare call it that, in some locations. Yeah, there are breeds that are really really culturally significant, and also very, importantly as well from us from a practical point of view, really well adapted to that landscape, and often where there have been herds that have been maintained for generations, they're quite well hefted to that land as well. So they even we're potentially coming in and encouraging the cattle to move differently. But those herds often have a really sort of good inherited knowledge, depending on how they've been managed and when young are taken off and what age cattle stay on the ground till. But yeah, it is so we have our kind of preferred breeds, I suppose, and then there are sort of cattle breeds that are a sort of reasonable proxy, but the basic kind of criteria has to be that they are sort of hardy, ideally able to calve themselves fairly reliably, and that's often not the case for a lot of breeds, but hardy outdoor breeds, and really horned is best, for all those reasons I talked about. But it's, I mean, I would say it's not essential, but it really does add a lot in terms of that kind of vegetation browsing effect. So like anything, when you come into a new landscape, you have to come in sort of with an open mind and as little dogma as possible, I suppose. But I suppose also we are there to do a job ecologically, and we just have to think about, are these cattle going to be genuinely adventurous enough to hike up this slope and challenge this patch of scrub? And if not, what is it that other than just this breed is from this region, is there, has that farmer got a particular kind of cattle characteristic that they really look for or appeals to them, and just is there a sort of breed that suits our purposes well, that that can work well there? And also to say that the way in which cattle are reared can have a really profound effect on how wild type their behavior is. So whilst we have those standard breeds that are generally more inclined to be more adventurous, to be more naturalistic, some hardy outdoor mountain breeds, Welsh Blacks or whatever they are, can actually already have a lot of that sort of behavior in there. So it's case it's case by case, basically, as to whether that breed is working well ecologically and from a livestock management perspective. Yeah, I'll stop because I could go on.
Thank you. Finley, perhaps one for you. A grazier of mine is reluctant. One reason is that she doesn't think it suits calves. Is that correct?
The definite recommendation for calves is to not put collars on them when they're under 6 months old. Apart from that, what I usually say to interested people is just what's on the other side of the virtual fence line if you're running calves without collars on. If it's just green grass on the other side, there's not too much to worry about. Those calves are going to be able to creep graze and steal the better grass that the cows aren't going to be able to access. But if you are running next to a busy main road or a expensive arable field, that could be cause for concern. But as long as that's not the case, the only other thing to look out for is just that the cows aren't getting too stressed out, that the calves are exiting the pasture and they can't follow them. But 9 times out of 10, from what I've heard, it's not an issue. And I mean, please get in contact with me, and I would be more than happy to put your grazier in contact with someone that's using the no fence system already. And I'm sure that would very easily alleviate any worries.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Finn. I'm just checking the Q&A panel. So as we're nearing towards the end, I think that's probably a good natural point to stop. Just in answer to a question, if you have missed any part of this webinar at all, that's not a problem. You will receive a recording of this webinar that will be sent to your email address. However, I'm going to send a few links in the chat in case you wanted to keep in touch with us. So I've just shared our LinkedIn profile, which is where we share all of our updates, which is the best way to keep in touch. I've also shared our website address, and I'm also now sourcing the No Fence website address so that you can easily find all of the contact details for both Sam and Finley. So there we go. If you head over to our website, restoredland.com, there is an option to sign up for the newsletter. In the newsletter, we will be sharing any content that we generate. So any webinars, those will be applicable to the sort of more landowning audience, as well as the more business audience. So we often tackle the both subjects of how we interact with land, how we manage land for ecological purposes, but also how can we engage businesses to generate meaningful action for nature. So do sign up to our newsletter to keep in touch, to receive all the updates, all of the recordings of our webinars and news about new events, as well as brilliant articles that Sam produces, and as well as his team and our other Natural Capital members. Finley, is there anything else that you would like to share as well from your side?
Not particularly. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I found it really, really interesting, and I'm looking forward to working closer with you guys in the future. If anyone else has any questions about No Fence, please feel free to reach out to me directly. You will find my contact details on the No Fence website that has been shared in the chat. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, both. Sam, anything that you would like to add to end?
I suppose nothing other than the fact that immediately after this call, I'm going back out into the woodlands here at the South Hill Estate. And Ben Sarcliffe, I can see you there. Say hello. So we talked a lot about the woods here. And whilst in the slides are kind of really focused on like those open flat pastures and how do we get those more structured, actually here one of our big challenges is how do we restructure and open up and make the woodlands more complicated, and how the cattle work in there. So I'm going to go straight from this and try and imagine cattle with no fence collars wandering around the woods, and then I'll probably have questions for both Finn and Ben. So
Brilliant. Well, from theory to practice straight away. Thank you all very much for joining us and for your time, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
okay.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.